So we just had Nobel-Prize season, but we're not talking about this year's winners in today's video. Instead, we're talking about a 2019 winner of the Nobel-Prize who's just had his 10th paper retracted. It is a massive scandal in the world of science. It's a massive knock of confidence on the Nobel Prize and its reputation. And perhaps the worst part of all of this was that this guy was involved in cancer research, which means that potentially millions of dollars that were supposed to be spent on helping to cure one of the worst diseases in the world was potentially wasted on fraudulent papers, dozens of them. What a waste of money. Now we're going to get into the details of this case in just a second, but if you're interested in not wasting your money, then one of the best ways to do that is to diversify your portfolio with Masterworks, who are kindly sponsoring today's video. If you don't know, Masterworks is a platform that allows everyday investors like you to buy shares in a luxury asset that has seen eye-popping appreciation over the last few years. Those assets are contemporary art. No, not that kind of art. I'm talking about real art, real paintings and things that you would see in popular museums and galleries all over the world. Masterworks have already generated over $45 million in art sales and distributed the proceeds to everyday investors just like you. They've got over 300 authenticated offerings from artists like Banksy, Picasso, and Monet, but they also have pieces from newer artists who are really blowing up in the art world right now. For example, Christine Ijo is an Indonesian artist who I personally have invested in, not only because I think that her work is really creative and beautiful, but also because the valuation of her artwork over the last few years has absolutely skyrocketed. Masterworks' last three exits have seen returns of 13, 17, and 77% to their investors, so it's no wonder why over 850,000 people have already joined the platform. Now, of course, past performance is no indication of future returns. However, if you are interested in investing with Masterworks, then be sure to use my special link in the description in order to skip the waitlist. Thank you, Masterworks, for sponsoring today's video. Let's get back to talking about our Nobel Prize winner. The subject of today's video is a researcher called Greg Semenza. He won the 2019 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, and he's an alumnus of Harvard University, of Penn University, of Duke University, and now he finds himself at Johns Hopkins University. Semenza's long and illustrious career has been mainly focused on the idea of hypoxia, which is when cells in the body are exposed to various levels of oxygen, and his research has revealed how cells can adapt and respond to these different levels of oxygen. And the implications of this research are supposedly massive. If the claims that he's making are true, then this could have huge implications for treatments for different diseases like anemia and, of course, cancer. So let's look at the evidence of academic fraud in Greg Semenza's papers. Some of these were found by an anonymous scientific fraud investigator by the name of Claire Francis. I believe that's a pseudonym and not their real name. And some of these were found by other fraud investigators, including Elizabeth Bick, who you'll remember was one of the key people in bringing down the president of Stanford University, Mark Tessier-Levine, in his recent scandal as well. So shout out to Claire Francis, whoever you are, and indeed Elizabeth Bick and all the other contributors who helped to point out the flaws in Greg Semenza's work. So let's take a look at some of the evidence. So this first one is from 2012, and as you can see, it's a form of ink blot manipulation. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the ink blot procedure, this is a result of a procedure in biological science called Western blot and the accompanying technique called STS page. Essentially what we're looking at here are the results of a test for different types of proteins. And so what these different blots resemble is that the lighter the blot, the less present that protein is, and the thicker and darker the blot, the more present that protein is. However, because this is a fairly organic process, there really shouldn't be any duplicated blots. Just the chance of that happening are basically impossible. And so when you look at something like this, you can clearly see that two of these blots have been just copy and pasted, photoshopped across, which is a manipulation of the results. We can see a very similar thing happening here in a 2013 paper. Again, just two of the blots have clearly been copy and pasted. And this one from 2014 is actually showing the absence of a protein. So we have two very faint, almost non-existent blots, but you can tell by the markings that they too have been copy and pasted across. Again, this is a manipulation of the results. And as if ink blot manipulation wasn't bad enough, there was even evidence of animal cruelty as well. This is a 2007 paper where he's doing some trials on mice. And as you can see, the untreated group, so this is a group of mice who had cancer and they were left untreated, were allowed to be left untreated for so long that their tumors got absolutely enormous. I mean, you can't even imagine the amount of suffering that these mice might have had to go through in order to be part of this study. I'm not a vegan or anything, but honestly, some of this stuff just like it makes me a bit sick, to be honest. Now, a lot of this data manipulation is pretty repetitive. It's a lot of copy and pasted blots. It's a lot of reused gel bands. It's a lot of the same thing happening again and again in many different papers across many different years from many different co-authors, but all with Greg L. Semenza's name on the paper. My editor here is just going to put a little compilation. Here you go. Tons of different papers. This is not a one-off incident of something looking suspicious. This is a consistent pattern over an entire career of research. So at the time of filming today's video, so far Greg Semenza has had 10 of his papers retracted, which of course is a massive scandal for anyone, but especially a Nobel Prize winner. The most recent paper to be retracted was just retracted a couple of weeks before I'm filming this on the 2nd of October 2023. And honestly, 10 papers seems pretty light, because as you can tell by the amount of evidence I've presented to you today, there's definitely far more than 10 papers that are suspicious in Greg Semenza's library. But other than these 10 papers that have been retracted so far, Greg Semenza has not really suffered any major losses. He still has his job as far as I can tell. He wasn't demoted. He hasn't lost his Nobel Prize. Really doesn't seem to have suffered any major career losses as a result of this honestly massive scandal. So that begs the question, why is this the case? Is it because he's a Nobel Prize winner and so he has a kind of halo above his head which makes him immune to any damages that might come towards him as a result of something like this? Or maybe it's because he's the deputy editor-in-chief of one of the leading medical journals that he himself has been publishing in, including some of these fraudulent papers. That journal is called the Journal of Clinical Investigation, or the JCI for short. Another reason perhaps why he hasn't suffered any major losses is because it's pretty hard to prove that he did any of this fraud himself. A lot of these papers that we're talking about here have multiple co-authors, many co-authors, of which Greg Semenza is just one, although usually he is the last author on the paper, which means that that author generally bears the responsibility for everything that goes into that paper and is submitted to the journal. So because of that, it is quite likely that Greg Semenza wasn't doing a lot of this data fraud himself and maybe just overseeing the people who did it. In my opinion, that still makes him responsible for the things that go into that paper, but you guys let me know what you think in the comments below. The other thing that's pretty sketchy about Greg Semenza's published research is that a lot of the co-authors on his paper are not from people who are based where he is. In fact, a lot of the papers, if you read the names of the authors, you can tell that most of them are China-based or Korea-based, and that often he will be the only non-Asia-based author on that list of co-authors on the paper. And so it seems to me pretty obvious that he likely had a pretty minor role in actually making that paper happen. I suspect that these groups of other authors who were investigating hypoxia decided to add Greg Semenza's name to their paper because they know that their paper is going to get a lot more attention and a lot more recognition if it has a Nobel Prize winner's name attached to it, and I suppose he just complicitly agreed to that without really checking the work too thoroughly. So that's what I suspect has happened here, though it is a lot of speculation. I don't have any evidence of that. It's just what I assume based off what I see here. It could be the case that Greg Semenza was Zoom calling these Chinese and Korean research teams on a daily basis, and therefore he would have pretty significant impact on the paper. Who knows? I should also say that it wasn't just Chinese and Korean teams that were involved with these suspicious looking data. There were plenty of American research teams that were also committing pretty egregious looking data fraud in these papers as well. So, it's certainly not a region-based thing. It is definitely an industry-wide problem, with Greg Semenza's name being the common thread. So what do you guys make of this kind of situation? Who do you think should be held responsible here? Should it be the final author on the paper, in this case Greg Semenza, or do you think it should be the earlier authors on the paper who are probably more directly involved with gathering the results? Do you think it's the journal who should be responsible? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. So here are my closing thoughts. Firstly, I think that it's absolutely disgusting that researchers who are paid to do cancer research into a disease that is really impactful on people's lives, that has long-lasting negative impacts on people's lives, would be wasted on dozens of papers like this with fraudulent results. In my opinion, it's absolutely disgusting. Secondly, I'll say that this further tarnishes the reputation of the Nobel Prize. Greg Semenza, unfortunately, is not the first Nobel Prize winner to have controversy around them, and while the more of these Nobel Prize winners who have stuff like this come out about them, it just makes the reputation of the prize go down more and more. Now, I'm not saying that all Nobel Prize winners are fraudsters. I certainly hope they're not. I think that a lot of Nobel Prize winners are just genuinely incredible people who have made amazing contributions, but it's certainly not a perfect system, and it's certainly not a badge of integrity. So what do you guys make of all this? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.